I would say millennials are arguably the most resilient generation.
All right. Okay, now we're talking.
Yeah. I mean, I would say my top line case for this is we grew up with analog parents and then ended up literally taking lead in this digital era. We did the biggest transition yet, just even in that lens.
We did grow up with analog childhoods.
Mm-hmm.
We grew up with dial-up modem
Yes.
internet. We went through the GFC. We
Yeah.
saw, 9/11 on TV and went through COVID in our 30s. It's been rough. Not to say that other generations before us haven't had it
Mm.
hard, but we're literally going through this revolution, this AI revolution,
Mm.
sort of either mid-career or during our pivot years. That's obviously quite challenging. It's not an easy feat.
Mm.
But what makes you think that it makes us the most resilient?
The fact that when we were so young when we literally started using the internet and like that really did like change our approach to how we were interacting with not only education but also social communication and then also entertainment. What our parents were telling was normal was also then being challenged by technological advancements. Our brains were already like trying to grasp two realities that felt kind of at odds. And I think being literally formed in that period of such drastic change, I don't know any science about this, but I felt like it made us quite adaptable of like, we need to get onto this really fast. I remember when in school, they were then bringing these like archaic computers into the room and saying, you got to feed this big disk into it to then do your like typing class, and like we were literally being like confronted or like challenged every second with a new skill, new tool, like constantly. And I felt like even our teachers didn't really understand what they were like handing us, That's what formed us as really resilient or like adaptable at a young age because we're just like fed another new thing, another big thing, another big leap, like literally going from these fat floppy disks or even tapes to then suddenly, like a couple years later, we had like a handheld mobile phone. What? Like, you know what I mean? Like, I just think the speed of adaptability at a young age made us quite resilient in our formative years.
I definitely agree with that statement in that we did have to adapt
Mm.
to so much change.
Mm.
And yes, you're right. Like, I remember having to take typewriting classes and,
Yeah.
to learn how to use a keyboard
Yeah.
because that was being introduced at school as well. And we were learning how to use the internet. But I think that's the thing. It's like one of the things that make us resilient, but at the same time, like exhausted, is the
Mm-hmm.
fact that we've had to constantly adapt and it's
Mm-hmm.
not stopping. Like
Mm-hmm.
now we're adapting to using AI, but growing up as well, like using all these new things, new pieces of technology that were constantly being rolled out.
Mm-hmm.
Our world was changing like constantly. I do think that the millennial generation, we're masters at adapting. We
I think
know
so
how
too.
to sort of change and, like I guess mold ourselves to the times. I think right now the biggest challenge for us is the AI revolution.
Mm.
That is because it's happening so much faster, but
Mm-hmm.
now it's not when we're in our 20s, like our teens or our 20s, but when we're in
Mm.
our 30s, and when we're just not as fast or we're not as adaptable because
Mm.
we've become a lot more comfortable in our lives.
Mm.
We're at that stage of, mid-career. A lot of us have families, have
Mm.
started families, and we're comfortable in our jobs. But then even that is being threatened because if we don't get on board the AI train, then we're going to be
Mm.
left behind.
Yeah. And I would say like maybe even like a disclaimer or not even disclaimer, like I think a differing view I might have on this is like I do think even though we are becoming more complacent and comfortable and older, I still think we are the most equipped to embrace the AI revolution or whatever we're calling it because of our history of adaptability to like tech. Because I would say even arguably like with Gen Alpha or Gen Z, they haven't gone through as big technological leaps as we have. Because I think, like, to your point, like, we have gone through a lot of change, but I feel like every generation can say that. As millennials, I think those leaps were much bigger than past generations. And I think it was bigger than what Gen Z and Alpha are going through. Like, we've been through those major, major leaps. And so I'm like, I do think, even though, yes, millennials are getting old and tired and complacent, and they are being, challenged with, are you going to adapt to AI or not? I do still think that we are the best positioned and primed to take it on. And I would say the ones that are leading AI are millennials, maybe some Gen Xers.
Okay, that's a fair point. I mean, we're a tired generation because we haven't been able to really catch a break, even with the development of AI. Sure, if we're at the forefront of it, it also means that we're having to work hard again, yet again, always working hard to, sort of push us through to a better time. I think, Gen Z, the way they see the world, they had to go through COVID in their sort of teens or like when they're even younger. And I don't, think that that's any better. I'm not saying woe is me as a millennial, but for our millennial listeners out there, I guess we're trying to say, we are still relevant, movers and shakers still, in the sense that without us, a lot of these advancements wouldn't have taken place. And we are still wanting to push for that change and use these tools to make things better. And I don't know what that means for like humanity or like whether or not this is ultimately going to be a good thing. But, I still think that it means that, we can still do things. We can try out new things. We can still change careers like we have, and for it not to be too late.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think even like to what you're saying, because we went through so much change, we kind of expect change. Like, we are the ones that want to enact on change. Like, we like to bring change. I feel like our millennials are very prone to being like, yeah, let's make change happen. And like, they're very proactive about it in whatever industry that they're in. I'm like, I think that is the beautiful part of like, yes, it feels like there's no rest to this change, that we're constantly having to like adapt and not settle. But then it has like birthed out a very beautiful thing out of like the millennial generation. We are advocates for change, and even goes into now like mental health and well-being, even that.
Yes.
It's like bled into every area where like, we grew up with, mental health being like, even talking about or getting help was seen as like, oh, like something's really wrong with you if you go see a therapist. But then we were like, no, this is a healthy thing to do. And a huge boom of like, people just willingly wanting the best for themselves without any shame or guilt, seeking mental health. And now it's normalized. I think that's insane.
Yeah.
In a great way.
Look, I mean, back when we were teenagers, seeing a therapist was highly stigmatized. That wasn't something that you did unless you had some severe mental disorder. Growing up in our 20s, wellness really wasn't a topic that we discussed. I think that's probably why so many of us drink and so many of us party through our 20s, because those were the years where you got to let your hair down and like, run wild and free. But, I think the wellness sort of discussion as well, mental health, like mindfulness, all of those things were also led by millennials, because we identified this isn't sustainable. We need to talk about suicide prevention. We need to talk about different sort of learning disabilities. We need to be okay with the fact that we all need help and we suffer from childhood trauma. Discussions, I think, were led by a lot of millennials. And, sort of maybe happened a little late in our sort of lives. But at the very least, I think, now a lot of Gen Z are benefactors of those sorts of movements that we started. So I think that's an amazing thing that we've achieved as a generation.
Yeah, definitely. I think it emerged because we were grasping with the reality that our parents' gen's reality was very different to ours. And we're seeing it unfold. Whatever they said was like, this will lead to, financial stability. No, that didn't happen for us because we were handed a really big economic crisis that like took out so many jobs and opportunities. We're like, the thing you told us that we needed to do that would bring us stability did not work out for us. We were brought up with parents that were comfortable, saving face for themselves, but then had probably tumultuous like home inside. And we're like, what is this? And like we saw all that happen. And so that's what drove us to be like, we need help for ourselves. Like we need to make this change for ourselves. And I honestly think the mentality that we gained through the technological advances of like, you can do this for yourself through these tools, I think it bled into how we approached life. Of like, if we want change, we can do it ourselves. It was like this empowerment like transaction that happened with like technological like development was like this empowering of self of like, I can do it for myself. And therefore, even with my emotional health, emotional well-being, like I can do this for myself.
That's a really interesting point because it got me thinking that maybe one of the reasons why millennials are so good with adapting and to change is because we grew up with boomer parents, and boomer parents being another generation that's so different from our generation, so much so that it's difficult for them to comprehend some of the issues or the difficulties we went through. We kind of had to sort of pick ourselves up and like go, okay, we need to fix these things and we're going to do it ourselves. And like maybe that sort of forced us to be a lot more proactive about how we want our futures to look and, what role we want to play in sort of making that sort of change or that impact. Now in this day and age where, I don't know, we don't want to be, we're not whining, we're not complaining, we're not saying that, we've had it tough, cut us some slack or something. Along those lines. I think the thing is, you also, like, we're human, we're tired, we also want to feel valued, all of that. And it's interesting because a lot of my friends who are just starting to have families or have kids, they're sort of talking about how they want to raise their kids. They want to raise their kids differently from the way they were raised, but also they're concerned about, how much freedom do you give them? Because without structure or discipline, are they going to be able to grow up as, decent human beings? So I guess that's another challenge that's coming our way.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, as we're starting to raise a new generation, those are real challenges and things to think about. Like, but I love it because it's rooted in millennials. We're the generation that chose to face their traumas and that chose to proactively break generational toxic behaviors. I think we were the first generation to really embrace that and be like, we're gonna do things differently. Let's see what happens. And I think that's so commendable. That speaks volumes to the childhood we grew up with, the circumstances we were dealt, and then we took it upon ourselves and felt empowered enough to be like, I'm going to do things different. And yes, and now we're in the period of, okay, can we make a difference? Like, are we actually going to, impart healthier lifestyles, healthier mentalities to our future kids' generation, and we'll see how good we are at it. I think we're in the midst of seeing our millennials able to raise healthy, amazing human beings.
Because we're talking about childhoods as well, had me thinking that, as second generation immigrants, like, that was another layer of difficulty, like trying to bridge a sense of understanding between our immigrant parents and the experiences that we were going through. So not only were we going through a period of, a lot of change societally, but also in our own sort of youth as like pubescent kids and, going like trying to understand the world. We also needed to try and help our parents understand what we were going through.
Yes.
Or like if we weren't actively trying to help them understand it, at the very least, we were trying to sort of reconcile why our parents were a certain way with, the people that we were becoming at school and growing up.
Yes, that makes it even more complex.
Yeah.
It's like I visually see it as like, yes, like we have this like immigrant layer factor, and then there's our present cultural layer of like whatever, you know, non-Korean or Asian country we grew up in. Like there's that layer, and then there's a technological layer, and then there's the little economic reality layer. And so for me, when I like talk to and hang out and try to relate to like my non-immigrant friends, I'm like, there's still like a really big difference of like, why does like my identity as an Asian American feel more fragile, even though culturally I went through a lot of the same things as like, you know, my non-immigrant friends. And I do think it's exactly that of it was the added immigrant layer that added even more deep like identity like confusion growing up. And so I don't know, like my observation of like I can only speak to Korean Americans is like either you listen so well to what society and your parents were telling you to do, and they like made it and grasped what they were always told to do and like go after. But now they're at this point of like, okay, now that I made it, now what? And like it feels like a very fragile of like, what's next
What's
after?
next?
What's
Yeah.
next? Like I built all of this because I was told to survive, but then like, but who am I? Or you ended up becoming this crazy rebellious like gangster or I don't know, like party druggy like kid, Korean American kid, and just veered off completely. And then now they're like also starting coming back to health. But it was like one or the other. There was like no middle, at least around like the people I grew up with. And I do think like that was literally like the fruit of all the complexities that I think we went through as millennial immigrant.
Yeah, it's really layered, isn't it? Because, you know, I think as immigrant kids at home, and I know that this resonates with a lot of other immigrant kids, but, you know, you're sort of raised to have to be exceptional. You
Yep.
know, the expectation is that you're going to do well at school and you're going to have a great white collar job and you're going to be a specialist in an area.
Yeah.
And if that was the expectation, and a lot of us sort of got there, you know, I have a lot of other immigrant friends who are, you know, doctors, lawyers, engineers, whatnot. And that was our generation, right?
Yeah.
And then, you know, we had to reconcile that with being taught at school that we were special and you could, you know, do anything you want, go after your dreams. The thing is, I guess, having to live with both of those worlds, you know, maybe that's why in our later years, I'm speaking for myself here, I decided to pivot. I decided to get out of that previous life that I had and pursue a completely different creative career. And I do wonder if, you know, as a millennial, having to sort of deal with, or like not deal with, really sort of lean into, sure, you can do whatever you want side, and then having ticked the box of you have to be a certain person side. It feels like we're just having to work so hard because we had to sort of please all these people and also be like the leaders in whatever we were doing, and then also have enough courage to change our circumstances for ourselves, and then, you know, make something of our lives again.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So maybe it's a combination of the immigrant life, but also the millennial sort of dream, and also now having to be like, okay, like, you know, where am I and am I going in the right direction, as you said before, because we've had to sort of juggle so many different perspectives and different values that we sometimes feel a little lost. And I think that's a really interesting point that we should maybe explore a bit more, sort of the loss of self that comes about from, you know, being an immigrant kid, but at the same time, like having to find ourselves, sort of make our own futures and not knowing where that is exactly.
Yes. Yeah. Because I feel like, sorry, like a lot of thoughts come to me visually in my head. So it's like, you know, like if, for instance, like we're getting all these streams of like teachings and advice and wisdom for this older generation of this is what life should look like. This is what life should look like. You know, it's like these like arrows or like directional arrows of what we should be going towards. Not only is it coming from like the older generation in general, but like a Korean perspective as well, like Korean immigrant parents. So like these arrows are like shooting towards like a very specific target, but then because of like our actual reality culturally, the target was constantly moving. It felt like this discrepancy of like, you told me to look this way, but then reality life is like the target's somewhere else. And it's like this like never ending chase of like expectation and reality. And reality was always saying it's actually a little bit different because of the speed of which things were developing. And I always felt confused because of that. And I don't know how else to say it, of like everything that I was being told to focus on and look like put all my energy into, like that wasn't really what I felt like reality, like real life was saying that was what was important in order to say, I wouldn't even say succeed because I don't even want to talk about like jobs per se, but like in life fulfillment. Like it just felt like it never lined up. And so like at a certain point, I decided there was only so much the older generation could tell me before I was like, it's actually not helpful. Like there's obviously generational timeless lessons that they give, but when it came to practicalities, I realized I never like took it too seriously because I was like, that's not what I'm seeing. Like that's not what I'm seeing in my reality. And then maybe that's where some of my like rebellious side came out.
And maybe it's also that misalignment that leads us to question things like, what do I really want out of life? What are your dreams? You know, and so many of us find it difficult to answer because maybe we had that when we were younger, but then with reality and with having to face all of that, we kind of lost that. You know, had to face the music in a way. And as we were trying to figure out answers to that question, we were getting older and, you know, real life things were happening and unfolding. So I do wonder, you know, someone recently asked me, like, what are your dreams? You know, and it's funny because, you know, those are questions that, you know, I've only started to really ask myself later, you know, not as I was growing up, because as I was growing up, the answer to that question was more about expectation as opposed to like what I truly wanted, you know, and I do wonder if this is part of being a millennial or, you know, I would love to know whether or not Gen Z are finding it easier to answer that question. I think we've, as a generation, had to learn to become more confident as opposed to having that within us, because as much as we were told we were special growing up, because there was so much disruption in the world around us, it really didn't feel like that was our reality. And I think going back to what you were saying about the you know, I guess the discrepancy between reality and expectation, I think that we've had to sort of even pave that, like pave our personalities and, you know, sort of change and modify the way we present in the world so that, you know, it felt more realistic and less dreamer. But now we're sort of trying to revert back to, you know, you had some childhood dreams, but like, let's go back to that. And, you know, don't be so scared to go after that. But is it too late? You know, that's the whole sort of dichotomy.
Yeah, I think that is